Good morning, everyone. I'd like to express my gratitude to you all for being here this morning. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. And I particularly want to thank Dr. Megan Hall, Thompson Guster, and Professor Thomas Berman for their extraordinary generosity, patience, and support in making this event happen. I also want to extend my thanks to the Medieval Institute as a whole, including its faculty and graduate students, for the warm hospitality and valuable intellectual engagement over the last few months. It has been one of the greatest privileges to be this year's Mellon Fellow and to be part of such an incredible intellectual community here at Notre Dame over the past 2 semesters. And as Tom mentioned, I'll be very sad to be leaving soon. And of course, my sincerest gratitude to the esteemed scholars who've joined me here today, some traveling from as far as Madrid, and their own work has shaped my own in fundamental ways over the years. So it's really, truly an honor to be here alongside you all today, and I eagerly look forward to our conversations. Let me see if I can figure out technology after 2 years of teaching on Zoom. Perfect. So my remarks today, I'm going to speak for about, let's say, 35 minutes tops. My remarks today seek to provide something of an overview of my book project and manuscript in progress. I'll begin by giving a very broad description of the historical and historiographical stakes before moving on to some of the key arguments, approaches, and sources. I'll conclude with a few reflections on the various pitfalls of the project and some of the challenges that I currently face in revising the book manuscript into a coherent monograph. So let me begin by illustrating the broader historical context for my project, basically what brought me to this project as a whole. So the mid-13th century was among the most cataclysmic moments in the history of the medieval Islamic world. The various Islamicate societies across Central Asia, the Near East, and the Mediterranean, including Iberia and North Africa, experienced a series of crises and transformations that laid the foundations for a new political and social order. The Mongol conquests and the establishment of Mongol dominion across much of the Eastern and Central Islamic lands culminated in the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad in 1258. Concurrent with the Mongol conquest, the Islamic West experienced its own set of crises, which was no less significant in transforming the political and cultural landscape of the region. The Almohad Caliphate, which had unified the entirety of Islamic Spain and North Africa for nearly a century, the last entity to do so, fragmented and collapsed. Simultaneously, the Iberian Christian kingdoms conquered most of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, between 1230 and 1270. These conquests by Castile, Portugal, and Aragon brought the majority of Islamic Spain under Christian rule by 1250. This was accompanied by the destruction of the very symbols of centralized political authority in both the Islamic East and the Islamic West, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, and only 11 years later, the Almohad Caliphate in Marrakesh. As in the case of the Near East, the invasion and conquest of the Islamic world by non-Muslims, including many of its urban centers, from Seville to Samarkand, fundamentally shaped both the articulation of political crisis and the various strategies of political legitimation and survival pursued by individuals, groups, and polities in the Islamic West during the 13th century. The emergence of Mongol and Iberian Christian hegemony established a new order across the Islamic world. Despite the major differences, of course, between Mongol conquests and processes of Iberian Christian expansion, they each produced similar outcomes: mass migration, millenarian reactions, the emergence of new institutions, and crises of Islamic authority and legitimacy. As the travels of the North African Muslim globetrotter Ibn Battuta remind us, these were not separate realms of the earth, but constituted an interconnected world characterized by what many scholars have termed a mutual intelligibility and bound together through intellectual, religious, and mercantile networks. One of the many responses to the emergence of this new political and social order in both the Islamic West and the Near East revolved around the articulation of legitimate kingship. I situate the emergence of Nasr Granada, which was the last surviving Muslim kingdom in Iberia, within this broader context of the crisis of the 13th century and the transformations that it brought. This polity was a borderland city-state, entrenched in the farthest reaches of the Islamic world between Europe and North Africa, yet closely connected and integrated within both Latin Christendom and the Islamic world. What you see on the slide right now is a 14th century, a late 14th century Catalan map of the Mediterranean with Nasr Granada prominently highlighted. Let me zoom into Granada for you. So the Muslim-Christian borderlands, which constituted the cultural universe of this kingdom during this period, were characterized by intermittent frontier warfare and shifting alliances between Nasrid and Castilian rulers and Marinid rulers from North Africa as well. The emergence of a bilingual nobility, conversant in Romance as well as Arabic, and the permeability of the frontier, which facilitated the passage and migration of mercenaries and merchants, renegades and refugees, scholars and slaves between the Islamic world and Latin Christendom. By the 14th century, which is the moment under study here, the Kingdom of Granada encompassed one of the most urban and diverse populations in late medieval Iberia. The mass migration of thousands of Andalusi Muslims to Granada in the wake of Castilian, Portuguese, and Aragonese conquest transformed it from a regional urban center into a thriving metropolis and one of the largest cities in the Western Islamic world. The population of Nasrid Granada was characterized by social and cultural heterogeneity. The Andalusi Muslims, who comprised the majority of the kingdom's roughly 300,000 inhabitants, were themselves descendants of communities from diverse geographic, ethnic, and social backgrounds from across Iberia and beyond. The consequence here of centuries of acculturation, conversion, and migration in the region. Granada was also home to various Jewish communities, significant garrisons of North African troops and their families, and large numbers of Iberian Christians, including renegades and enslaved peoples and their descendants. The case of Nasrid Granada provides, I contend, remarkable insight into the various social, cultural, and political processes occurring in the late medieval Islamic world. These included the reconceptualization of sovereignty and political legitimacy, new intellectual and religious syntheses, bureaucratization, and the emergence of local identities. The city-state illustrates the ways in which the various ideas, traditions, and institutions of the medieval Islamic world were transformed and even flourished within this new context. The urban setting of these polities were sites in which sovereignty was negotiated and which witnessed the greatest bursts of cultural efflorescence, intellectual creativity, and political innovation during the late medieval period. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the cities of Granada, Tlemcen, Fez, and Tunis produced some of the most remarkable intellectuals in the history of the Islamic world, despite the numerous challenges of the era. Their voluminous writings, which included things like historical chronicles, letters, autobiographies, and scientific treatises, serve as a window into both this cultural renaissance and the turbulence of the age. It is through an interrogation of how moments of political crisis, transition, and transformation are reflected in the writings of these individuals that we can better understand the important role of these actors and thinkers in shaping the collective memory of society, the development of its institutions, and the transmission of particular ways of thinking and knowing. Let me now turn to the specifics of my book project after this long sort of preface. So my monograph in progress, provisionally titled Lord of the Pen and Sword, Genealogy and Sovereignty in the Islamic West, proposes a new reading of the history of Nasrid Granada that examines the interplay between crisis and efflorescence, political fragmentation, and intellectual innovation by closely studying the life and works of Lisan ad-Din ibn al-Khatib, the most prominent Spanish Muslim historian, chancellor, and physician during the 14th century. As a leading example of a scholar-statesman in the late medieval Mediterranean, and the individual from medieval Granada for whom we have the most writings and surviving manuscripts, Ibn al-Khatib is a valuable object of historical study, whose life and works provide tremendous insight into the late medieval Islamic world during a moment of crisis and transformation. My work attempts to situate this figure within a broader community of letters, a network of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars that extended from Toledo to Damascus, in order to illustrate how royal networks of patronage, itinerancy, and mobility shaped the production of knowledge and facilitated the diffusion of novel conceptions of sovereignty and legitimate authority during the late medieval period. So the first part of my book draws upon a corpus of manuscripts and edited texts, including historical chronicles, political treatises, epistolography, biographical dictionaries, and poetry, to argue that the crisis and transformation that characterized the territorial fragmentation of Islamic Spain and North Africa contributed to the rise of a distinct class of what I'm calling scholar officials, who reshaped the intellectual and political culture of the Western Islamic world. These highly educated individuals rose to prominence as chancellors, treasurers, physicians, astrologers, and counselors within the royal courts in Iberia, and were responsible for producing a multitude of works across various genres, while patronizing pieces of art and architecture that embodied their particular worldview. Not unlike their counterparts in the Spanish Christian kingdoms of Castile y León and Aragon during the same period, who we call letrados, These chancery officials in Granada developed forms of historical writing that sought to legitimate their own position in society and perpetuate distinct ideas about kingship, politics, and society. This class of scholar officials also shared much in common with many of their contemporaries across the Islamic world, including Rashid ad-Din Fazlallah, the physician minister of the Ilkhanids in Iran, and Mohamad Ballan, a Persian emigre scholar official who was integral to the development and legitimization of the Bahmanid realm in the Deccan in South Asia. For much of the 14th century in Nasr Granada, various members of the secretarial elite occupied some of the most senior offices within the kingdom and contested power with the nobility, often quite violently. These scholar functionaries were primarily members of provincial families. They could be wealthy merchants, and some were immigrants from Christian Spain who had established themselves in the royal administration. Their rise to prominence was facilitated by the establishment of the royal chancery and scriptorium in the Comares Palace of the Alhambra during the 1280s. This institution, the chancery and the scriptorium, became an important avenue for the social mobility of townsmen and provincial families, who came to acquire a great deal of political influence following their appointment to positions in the royal administration as secretaries, judges, and financial officers. As a result, the Nasr Chancery was among the institutions most clearly and directly shaped by the migration of Andalusi elites, as indicated by the large number of scholars and functionaries who were employed within it, and had begun their careers in provincial towns and regions outside Granada, and actually, in many cases, often outside of the Nasr kingdom itself. Due to the large number of scholars that populated it, the Nasr Chancery effectively functioned as one of the most important institutions of learning in Granada. This is also one of my key arguments in the first part of the book. There is no college in Granada in the 1280s. The first college and the only college in Andalusi history is built in 1349, right? So this process of provincial elites or emigre scholars rising to senior positions within the Nasrid administration continued throughout the 14th century, with individuals from places like Malaga, Ceuta, Arcos, Jaén, Almería, and Loja, among other places, migrating to the royal capital, Granada, and entering the service of the sovereign and his court. And the word for capital that's used here is hadra, right? Like basically the center, the locus of authority. So this is like, again, this urban polity is really defined by this new conception of a capital in some ways. So these individuals within the royal administration who began their careers as poets, secretaries, physicians, gradually emerged as a distinct and influential group in society and often referred to themselves as such, that played a major role in shaping both the institutional and political developments, as well as the intellectual culture of the Nasr kingdom. During the first half of the 14th century, 5 individuals who had begun their careers as financial officers, scribes, or physicians rose to the position of chief minister, wazir, the highest executive office within the Nasr kingdom. The unique skill set of these individuals made them indispensable to many ruling elites, who themselves increasingly embodied the intersection between learning and governance, who appointed them to senior positions of executive authority across the Islamic West. And Nasr Granada provides us one of the clearest case studies of this. What's happening across the Islamic West is nowhere clearer than what's happening in Granada. First of all, we have the actual sources to demonstrate this. By the late 14th century, these scholar officials composed treatises that sought to enshrine this arrangement within political theory. As indicated by this quote by one of the Sanadin ibn al-Khatib's most prominent students, the Nasrid scholar official, Ibn Simak al-Amali, who mentions, as a matter of fact, right, not as an argument, but as a matter of fact, the appointee to the office of chief minister should be a competent scribe with a firm knowledge of epistolary and calligraphy, a literateur with an expertise in history of nations and kings. This was not the common qualification for wazirs across the Islamic world. This is a very interesting and novel perception of what the office of the vizirate should be, although it has antecedents, of course. The power that these individuals wielded, and more specifically, their open display and performance of that power, earned them the enmity of the nobility, who contemptuously represented them as mere scribes or bookkeepers who had risen far beyond their station. The opposition of the nobility was rooted in their concern that the increased delegation of royal authority to secretarial elites, whose power was based on their close relationship to the sovereign, threatened their own privileged position in society. And the precarious status of these scholar ministers is indicated by the fact that most of them met very violent ends at the hands of the nobility. Of the 5, only one survived and he was exiled. So unlike the aristocratic and patrician families within the kingdom, the court secretaries and palace officials in Nasr Granada did not find themselves advancing politically due to their family lineage, wealth, or social status, but largely as a result of their distinct education and specific function at court. A poetic couplet by one provincial individual from Loja, a village located several miles to the west of Granada, who found employment within the Nasr Chancery, writing to his son, shows the manner in which learning was often conceived as part of a broader family strategy for social mobility. And he writes to his son, medicine, poetry, and the secretarial arts have elevated us to nobility and excellence. These three things have raised us to lofty appointments, including the office of royal chamberlain. Several years later, this son, Lisan ad-Din ibn al-Khatib, would rise from this position as a scribe and physician in the Nasrid court to become one of the most powerful chief ministers and chancellors within the history of the Islamic West, exercising supreme control over the political, military, and fiscal spheres. So the second part of my book zooms in into the life of Ibn al-Khatib, and it utilizes his life, it utilizes his writings to illuminate the phenomenon of the scholar official in Nasr Granada, while studying the emergence of these individuals as an embodiment of the tremendous administrative innovation, social mobility, and political creativity that characterized the Islamic West during the 14th century. So who was he? Born in the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, the last surviving Muslim polity in Iberia, as I mentioned, in 1313, Ibn al-Khatib began his career as a scribe, physician, and poet in the Nasrid Royal Palace, the Alhambra, before rising to become one of the most influential statesmen in the Islamic world. My book provides the first comprehensive study in English of this figure's life, from his birth into a minor provincial family in Loja in 1313, to his rise as a physician and scribe in the Nasrid court, his social and political evolution from a client and servant of the Nasrid dynasty into a powerful chancellor, to his controversial assassination in 1374 at the hands of many of his former students and friends. Not a great end to the story, but very common end to the story for many of these people. This section situates his rise within the context of the emergence of an urban-based secretarial elite, whose members included Jews as well as Muslims, that gradually came to wield a significant degree of executive political authority and contest power with the established nobility. Alongside the performance of these substantial administrative and political duties as Nasrid Chancellor and Chief Minister, and we can talk about the specifics if one is interested, Ibn al-Khatib authored over 60 works, many of which survive, including historical chronicles, epistolography, biographical dictionaries, poetry, philosophical works, and medical tracts throughout his career. These have long been recognized as important across disciplines, as illustrated by their ubiquity in the footnotes of numerous research articles and books dedicated to topics ranging from Umayyad Spain, Arabic poetry, political theory, scholarly networks, mystical theology, and more recently, the history of medicine in the medieval Mediterranean. He wrote one of the first, most important plague treatises, for example, which has attracted a lot of attention recently. Ibn al-Khatib also left his imprint on the very shape of the city of Granada itself, just like the letrados in Spain, constructing palaces, lodges, fortifications, as well as playing a key role in founding the city's great hospital in 1365. As a physician, philosopher, and historian, he was also at the forefront of the intellectual developments of the age. His thought was heavily shaped by the turbulent times in which he lived. I mean, you see imprints of this all over his corpus, which witnessed, the period that he lived in, witnessed the political and territorial fragmentation of Islamic power in Spain, as well as the devastation of the Black Death. This is something that's quite key to his writings after 1349, especially, which coincides, by the way. He became chief minister in 1349, 1 month after the Black Death hit Granada. This is something that's quite significant. And he is a physician. So that aspect of the project will come out hopefully in the conversation. So Ibn al-Khatib's intellectual circle was as expansive as his political universe, a fact which can be gleaned from the rich corpus of over 200 surviving letters that he exchanged with contemporary scholars, nobles, and rulers from Toledo to Cairo. And bound together through shared scholarly interests, extensive epistolary correspondence, and ties of patronage of friendship, this community of letters bore remarkable resemblance to similar intellectual networks elsewhere in the medieval world. And just to give you a sense of who this included, we're talking about people like Ibn Khaldun, the famous historian. We're talking about Ibn Battuta, who was his next door neighbor at one point in Morocco. We're talking about Joseph ibn Abraham ibn Waqar, who was one of the leading sort of scholars of the Jewish community of Toledo, Arabophone scholar. Possibly even Pedro Lopez de Ayala, the Chancellor of Castile, who appends 2 of his letters into one of his chronicles. It was the dual identity, although the verdict is still out on that. So we'll talk about that maybe. It was the dual identities and role of many of these authors as both scholars and statesmen that shaped their writings, their statecraft, and their conception of the world. Their theorization and chronicling of politics and the nature of legitimate authority was often underpinned by their status as recipients of royal patronage and their distinct experiences as statesmen, as well as their specific intellectual commitments. So the third and final part of the book illustrates how scholar officials were essentially architects of political legitimation and sovereignty, who drew upon various intellectual disciplines, including law, theology, history, ethnology, medicine, philosophy, to construct an Islamic city-state. It examines the ways in which genealogical notions of Arabness, Urubiyya, were interwoven by people like Ibn al-Khatib into the very construction of royal sovereignty. It looks closely at how Ibn al-Khatib and his network of scholar officials played a role in crafting a particular image of Nasr Granada, which communicated that far from being a minor city-state on the fringes of the Islamic world, Granada was a bulwark of Islam, with its rulers essentially acting as representatives of God and the Prophet in defending the faith, upholding its institutions, beliefs, and practices, and enforcing justice. This was the image that Ibn al-Khatib would tell to everyone who would listen, and he made sure that he transcribed hundreds of copies of his works and sent them to the Islamic East. So this was a very deliberate self-image that he was trying to create, both of himself as chief minister and of the kingdom in which he functioned. So let me provide a little more detail about my argument in this section of the book, which might be useful for highlighting some of these competing threads of my research, and might give you a sense of how I work methodologically and some of the problems of how I work or what I'm trying to do here. It was specifically the Royal Chancery in the Alhambra, as I mentioned, the site in which artisans, literateurs, kings, scholars, functionaries, philosophers, and jurists converged, that many of these discourses about sovereignty were conceived, articulated, and disseminated. The interdependence between scholar officials and the king underpinned the concerted attempts of the former group to articulate a particular ideal of centralized royal sovereignty. In fact, we can't really think about sovereignty in this period without reference to the scholar officials. So one has to wonder, sovereignty, which is again a definition that we will have to come to at some point, is very much the product of these individuals. It's hard to access the Nasrids themselves without recourse to these people's writings. So in which the ruler, this is the vision that they advocated, the ruler and not the nobility, not the jurists, and definitely not a distant caliph, was the sole source of legitimate authority. This idea of sovereignty found its clearest expression in the employment of the title of caliph, Khalifa, by the Nasrids throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. And the usage of the caliphal title was not intended to imply a claim to the traditional juridical caliphate, which many people understand through their courses on Islamic history or their readings of generalist kind of scholarship, but with its far-reaching universal aspirations, prerequisite of descent from Muhammad's tribe of Quraysh, or the recognition of such a claim by other Muslims. The Nasrids had none of these and could care little for any of them. Rather, it was an assertion of the royal legitimacy of the Nasrids, their role as upholders of Islam and defenders of the faith, as well as their absolute independence from any foreign power. The employment of the title of Khalifa was fused with notions of noble Arab and Islamic lineage in particular to construct a specific vision of Nasrid sovereignty. This was further complemented by the development of an elaborate dynastic legend that linked the Nasrid sovereigns to the ancient Himyarites of Southern Arabia, a claim to pre-Islamic royal lineage that brought together notions of kingship and Arab genealogy. So narratives and articulations of kingship in Nasr Granada wove together threads of Arab descent, militancy, justice, and vicegerency, divinely mandated authority, to represent the rise of Nasrid sovereigns as providential, an embodiment of divine mercy, rahmah, in which the king was essentially God's instrument in the restoration and revival of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula following the cataclysm and crisis of the mid-13th century. It falls within the realm of tajdid, renovatio, if you will, within the Islamic world in this period. It is these broader notions that form the essential context for the declaration by Ibn al-Khatib's own predecessor and patron, the Nasr Chancellor Ibn al-Jayyad, that Ismail I of Granada was the caliph of the most merciful, Khalifat ar-Rahman, the best of kings, Khair al-Muluk, chosen from the most supreme kings of Qahtan, Southern Arabia, who followed in the footsteps of his honorable ancestors, the supporters, the Ansar of the best of creation, who hailed from Adnan. So this phrase was inscribed on the north pavilion of the Khanalife Palace of the Alhambra, providing the earliest epigraphic evidence from Nasr Granada of the employment of the title Khalifa for the rulers of this kingdom. During the 14th century, and that's the palace that many of you may have visited. During the 14th century, or should visit, I should say, the caliphal title appears in various forms and contexts in Nasr Granada, but the most common formulas are Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, Khalifat Rabbil Alameen, Caliph of the Lord of the universe, Khalifat Allah, God's Caliph, and Al-Khalifa al-Imam, the Imam Caliph. And you notice here, it's not Caliph of the Prophet of God. This is directly linked to a theological vision of sovereignty here. The usage of the caliphal title continued until the very last days of the Nasr kingdom. This is not just in one moment in the 14th century. So these titles and notions of sovereignty are evident, for example, on surviving royal documents from the reign of Muhammad XI, Wa'abd, right? The last Nasrid ruler of Granada, including one that has been preserved in the convent of Las Comendadoras de Santiago in Madrid. And this is published, so it's like I'm getting this image from the published work. It employs the particular construction, as you can see here, of Al-Imam Al-Khalifa and Al-Khalifa Al-Imam for his father. So by the 14th century, the term Khalifa or Khilafa was ubiquitous as a synonym for kingship across the courts elsewhere in the Islamic West. We see this everywhere. In every manuscript, every genre you can think of, prefaces of all these works, you can see this so clearly, especially in works composed by Ibn al-Khatib's intellectual network. So one particular text produced by a key member of Ibn al-Khatib's network significantly illuminates the particular logic behind the employment of these terms. This work was titled On Sovereignty and the Politics of Kings and officially authored by the Zayyanid ruler Abu Hamid Musa II, but actually it was kind of ghost written here by his chief minister and counselor, Abu Zakaria Yahya ibn Khaldun, who was the much lamented and forgotten younger brother of the famous historian, and far more interesting younger brother, I should say, of the famous historian. So this text provides a clear definition of kingship and the usage of the term Khalifa in the context of the 14th century Islamic West, where it's declared that the king is the representative of God on earth. Al-Malik Khalifat Allah fi ardh. The one who is entrusted with establishing his will and the individual who has been endowed with sovereign authority to provide justice and enforce his laws. This reflects the way in which the employment of the caliphal title in the Islamic West rendered obsolete the notion that kings, sultans, and emirs were invested with legitimacy and authority by a universal symbolic caliph. Rather, sovereigns and kings, by virtue of the fact of their authority and kingship, possessed the divine mandate to rule and were effectively God's representatives on earth. This reformulation of legitimate authority by Ibn al-Khatib and other scholar officials in the Islamic West who are writing in the aftermath, we should remember again here, of the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, the destruction of the Almohad Caliphate in 1269, was prompted and enabled by the absence of a singular central authority, despite claims, right, to continuity by the Hafsids of Tunis, who claimed the mantle of the Almohads, or the Abbasids of Cairo, who claimed the mantle of the Abbasids of Baghdad, right? So the reconceptualization of royal sovereignty in terms of caliphal authority I'm not mentioned here was not confined to the Islamic West. We see similar things in the Mamluk context, for example. Even though there is an actual caliph there, right, an Abbasid caliph, the Mamluk Sultan still claimed to be Khalifat Rabbil Alameen. So it kind of creates an interesting dual system in some ways here. And the terms Khilafa and Khalifa were also widely utilized for kingship within the Persianate lands during the 15th and 16th centuries, including in the Timurid context in Iran and Central Asia, and in the Ottoman Sultanate in the late 15th century onwards. And this has been the subject of much recent scholarship, which I won't go into right now. But I will give you one example of a text that shows something quite interesting happening here. And one of the most significant examples from the Near East can be found in the writings of the Persian philosopher Jalaluddin Davani, died in 1502, who utilized the title Khalifat al-Rahman for the Aqiyun Sultan Uzun Hasan in the mid-15th century. And this is from his Arznameh, but it also appears with some variation in his Akhlaqi Jalali. It is notable that this was the identical form as it was deployed for Ismail I of Granada in 1320, although 100 and something years later. So this theorization of kingship with the ruler exercising supreme authority within their own realm was also in close conversation with developments across the frontier in Christian Iberia. In the mid-13th century, the Castilian king, Alfonso X, within his Siete Partidas, had proclaimed that kings, each one in his own kingdom, are the deputies or representatives of God, appointed over people to maintain them in justice and truth in temporal matters, just as the emperor does in his empire. While recognizing, and this is crucial, the particularities of each of these contexts, right? The developments in the Near East and Central Asia, as well as Castile, allow us to situate the Nasrid reformulation of kingship in terms of divinely mandated vicegerency, khilafa, as part of a broader political and philosophical discourse taking place across the Mediterranean world and the Near East. And while sharing much in common with their contemporaries in the Persianate and Arabic-speaking lands, who were also engaged in multiple strategies of legitimation as they sought to grapple with the emergence of a new political reality, the writings of Ibn al-Khatib and his circle represented a distinctly Andalusi attempt, and North African attempt, because what's happening in Merida, Morocco also has its particularities, to rationalize and justify this logic of royal authority. In the case of Nasr Granada, it was put to specific work in the service of the construction of the boundaries and sovereignty of an Islamic city-state, and was integrated into a broader discourse about genealogy and religious identity in a borderland context. So finally, let me just give you a few reflections about the manuscript as it currently stands very quickly. So as you may have gathered during just the past 29 minutes, there are so many things that animate my research. And some of them need to be pulled apart, but some of them are coming together in new ways. And these include the intellectual biography of the Sanadid of al-Khatib, the history of scholar officials, royal patronage and intellectual networks, Muslim Christian borderlands in late medieval Iberia, and the articulation of kingship and sovereignty in the Islamic West. And as the book manuscript remains in draft form and continues to undergo major revisions, the attempt to weave these threads together has not always been successful, maybe not even in this talk. I'll let you be the judge of that. And while synthesizing them into a coherent argument has often been difficult. But I'm starting to think maybe it might be fruitful not to synthesize them, but also to disaggregate some of them into at least 2 or 3 of these themes can be, for example, articles. They can become maybe a future monograph in its own right. Who knows? We'll figure this out, hopefully. One of the greatest challenges and obstacles that I have faced, I'm not going to go into all the obstacles because I can't keep you here for 5 hours, but one of the greatest challenges and obstacles that I have faced is the tension between a biographical approach to the subject and a thematic one. The value of intellectual biography is that it allows for the exploration of the specific social, intellectual, and political factors that shaped Ibn al-Khatib's writings, which remain among the most important sources for the history of Granada, as I mentioned. And the monograph seeks to illustrate his role at the intersection of intellectual and political developments to argue that his literary production was closely intertwined with his function as a statesman. So writing this as an intellectual biography would allow me to do just that. Given the centrality of Ibn al-Khatib's writings as a source for much of the history of the late medieval Islamic West, one of my driving concerns since the inception of this project was to illustrate that his various works need to be understood not as some random encyclopedia that we can pull off a shelf to confirm a fact, but actually were inextricably tied to his own life and context. I've never seen a chronicler use the first person as much as Ibn al-Khatib, I have to say. His historical writings were always strategic, in the service of something, whether people, ideas, or places, or I should say against something, more likely, and often reflected his distinct circumstances. So the monograph, as you gleaned, also adopts a very thematic approach. That's what's present currently, particularly as it seeks to shed light on the important role played by scholar officials in crafting a new language of sovereignty in the 14th century. That's where that's most present. The thematic approach, while valuable for highlighting important antecedents and comparisons between Nasr Granada and other parts of the medieval world, is also unwieldy for exactly the same reasons. It is quite impossible to write a history of scholar officials, I'm sadly beginning to realize, that incorporates Castile, North Africa, Byzantium, and the Near East, let alone the Deccan in South Asia, without losing sight of the specificities of the phenomenon in Nasr Granada, which I still think is important and deserves its own study, which is what I hope to do. In order to be executed properly, such a comparativist approach would also require the mastery of numerous languages, technical skills, and bodies of historiography, which are beyond the capacity of any one individual. Maybe a future interdisciplinary conference funded by an ERC grant would be in order here, but right now that's not what we have. Despite these challenges and the serious work that lies ahead to address them, my book continues to aspire to generate an interdisciplinary conversation among historians, Arabists, and medievalists, while reintegrating the late medieval Islamic West into histories and historiography of both the Islamic world and Latin Christendom. It seeks to do so while providing some new insights about the value of Islamic intellectual history for thinking about the interconnectivity of the medieval Mediterranean world. And in this, I share hopefully the same kind of motivations as our esteemed director. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing all your comments and questions. Thank you.